All right, guys, welcome back to the Sagey Bard podcast, where we discuss business finance, health and wealth, and social issues with a unique perspective. Guys, today we are doing the business of Black American slave owners, the hidden history of Black American slave owners. Seiji is very passionate about this topic, and he's going to be presenting. I'm going to be asking questions, and we will follow up with a live, maybe in another 6 or 7 days from now. What do you think, Seiji?
We can do a lot on this topic because I've actually researched this a fair amount. And just so you guys know, I love all types of history. So this is just one of the topics that I have studied and I really want to share with people. And when we say we have a unique take on it, I think that you'll see that come out as we get towards the end. But anyways, we've got a really interesting topic.
Exactly.
Again, what we're talking about right now is Black slave owners in the South. And that's something that most people don't even know about.
Before we get into it, why do you think people don't know about this? It's kind of a rhetorical question on my part, but just for the audience, why do you think Americans, especially Black Americans, don't know about this? Wouldn't this be advantageous to the two people who want to prove that you know slavery was also a black institution starting in Africa? Wouldn't this be advantageous to them to want to mention this? Why was this
Well, I think
left
that
out of the American curriculum? Why do you think?
well, I think that there are some people who do introduce this topic, like Thomas Sowell, but it's very rare that it comes up. I think that
Mhm.
if you say that history is written by the victors, to a large degree, white people aren't going to talk about it. I think, at least white Northerners. And when you look at it with those in the Black community, they're not going to talk about it because it doesn't fit the narrative of white slave owners and fit within strict confines of race.
I think I get a whenever things are omitted from American history, especially as something is what's the word? Something is volatile, for lack of a better term. I can't think of anything stronger. If something as volatile as the topic of slavery and how it provides a dividing line in American society and globally as well. I'll be honest, as an African American, the stench, the sting, the vestiges, the legacy of slavery, it follows you. And the thing is my family's not even from America, and neither is yours. But I've assumed this identity because I was born here, so I get this placed on me just by virtue of having an American accent.
Yeah.
But why do you think? Okay, well, let me say this. I think there is a point. I think still to this day, I think there are people in America who want segregation without the label of segregation, and there you could see little things happening, whether it be in the real estate market, how they draw, the redlining of different communities. Um, it's very active. Like a lot of people will do undercover
Well, I think that a lot of people might
investigations.
want socioeconomic segregation as opposed to
Right, which is what
strictly
it was.
racial segregation.
Right, it's akin. I mean, yeah, it is akin to what it once was back then. It was all about socioeconomics. I think being a slave is is a socioeconomic class.
Hmm.
The economics of slavery are you own nothing. You are owned. And the social aspect is you're a slave. It's just like, serfdom Old Europe. So I think here's my thought before we get into this topic. I think that the logical answer for me is that this was not put in the educational curriculum. Look, we have a African American History Month, right? We have 28 days to utilize and propagandize, which I believe it is. I think it's a bunch of propaganda to create a further divide. And this is evidenced by, let me mention this really quickly before I forget. I heard this, I don't have a source on this, but I did hear this. They tested American fifth graders, and they found that in the fifth grade is when they start this African American history. I'm going to put quotations there because it's not. It's propagandistic because it's not updated, and it doesn't. The focus is hyper focused on slavery, and as a result, what they found is that kids begin to self segregate in the fifth grade. So I think this is another ploy to divide amongst socioeconomic lines, which just so happen
Well,
to
I think
be
that
color
this
lines as
topic
well.
is interesting because while it is a surprising topic for many, it's important for people to know, because I think that what it would highlight is that when you know that there are black slave owners, it shows that black
Right.
people in America had the same motivations as white people in America. There's no difference. We are all humans. Slavery is an
Right.
institution that has existed, unfortunately, since the beginning of mankind.
Right. Let me this would be a great time for me to interject this as well. I got to talk to some West Africans from West Africa, right? Who told me slavery from their perspective, which is really
Uh-huh.
fascinating. And we're going to get into some slides, guys. We're going to be showing you some really, Seiji is going to be presenting some really interesting information. So definitely hold on. Give us a like. Definitely subscribe. We're going to be bringing some really, really
And
important information here over the
and
next
Bart, it's
year.
actually fascinating that you're bringing up the topic of slavery from a West African perspective, because slavery in Africa was different than slavery in the American or in the United States and the American colonies. Because slavery in most other places, and that differentiates itself from American slavery, is slavery was a lot more fluid, where people could become assimilated into another culture, whereas that was not
Mm-hmm.
possible in the American colonies for a number of reasons that we can go into. And there are papers that I have regarding slavery in West Africa as well, and how it was a lot more humane than slavery in the United States, which sounds
Okay,
ridiculous
let's do
when you're
this.
talking about humane
Yeah,
slavery.
it does sound ridiculous. It sounds, but it is what it is. So here's what these guys told me. They told me, and what's interesting, I saw, just to kind of segue again, and I'm going to get back into the topic. I'm making an analogous point. Today there was a clip of a young lady, a friend of mine. Hey Veronica, sent me, and it shows a young lady talking about how they are finding hidden compartments, tunnels in hotels, in hotel rooms, which are being used for human trafficking.
Oh,
So a
wow.
woman, I would imagine a woman would, uh, well, maybe a woman would be in the hotel, or maybe we really don't know. I really don't know the full scope, but what I do know is that those tunnels are being used for human trafficking, and they're in hotel rooms. So I was thinking about it today, and I realized what they would probably do is they would kidnap someone, bring them into the hotel room, this designated room, which would probably never be rented out, or rented out sometimes, then take them down this hidden corridor, and then whisk them off to, and the interesting thing is a lot of hotels are near the airport. And what I was finding out from someone who watched, I think it's a new Netflix series called The Cry of Freedom, not Netflix. Yeah, it's on Netflix, The Cry of Freedom or something about child sex trafficking. They grab these kids, and before you know it, the kids are off in Mexico and on a flight overseas, and it's over. You never see them. And from what I'm hearing, after they're done using them for their deviant sexual purposes, they end up harvesting them for their organs, which is incredibly sad. The reason why I mention this is because what the West African, one was from Togo. No, two were from Togo. Excuse me, one from Togo. No, two were from Togo. They were both visitors. It's at church. And then a member of church who's from Nigeria. And they had a similar story. So what was happening at that time was they had bad criminal African gangs. At this time, the Europeans couldn't make their way into the interior of Africa. They weren't allowed to by the Africans. So they could only go to the shores and meet there to trade. So the Africans, they had Africans who would do their dirty work. So they would go and kidnap people from different tribes and then bring them to a location and then transport them to the coast and then get their whiskey or their guns or whatever they were getting for, this illicit trade. And it was really interesting because one of the
Bart, I just want to push back a little right here, because you say that they're doing their dirty work, and I think that is not entirely correct, because I think that it, again, and the reason I don't like that term is because it makes Africans look like they were pawns of a European game. And what actually happened is they were totally complicit in the slave trade. In fact, just as you said,
that's what I was mentioning.
Yeah, white people did not penetrate into the interior of Africa until after the Treaty of Berlin, 1884, 1885. And that was well after the slave trade had officially ended in the United States as well as the British Empire, and only 4 years before it officially ended in Brazil. So it basically involved black slave or black tribes attacking and capturing other tribes that they just didn't like and selling them. It's like getting rid of your problem permanently.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was getting at. It was black people, criminals. This is what the African guys told me. It was thugs, they said, who were going around and kidnapping people. And the stories, the passed down oral, not tradition, but the stories go like this. They would go out to get water in the morning, never come back. So it was sort of like the human trafficking we have right now. People will go on vacation, disappear, never see them again. Kids will go out to play, get captured by these people who go around grabbing kids from neighborhoods, kids who are walking to school, that kind of thing. There are teams of people who go around and grab these kids and whisk them off. And, and they're well connected and to powerful people. So they put them on private jets and they're gone. Never to be seen again. 67,000 plus missing African-American women in this country. Don't know where they are, haven't seen them, gone. And we think they've been disappeared into this black market, this underground black market. And just think about that, 67,000 people, black women, gone. So no one knows where they are, but my suspicion is that it's human trafficking and organ harvesting somewhere along the end of the line with their assembly line. So anyway, that's basically it. The Africans, these guys were telling me that criminal. So the end of the story, this is actually an interesting story, and most African Americans would have never heard anything like this. But the guy from Togo, one of the guys from Togo, an older guy, he told me that he was telling us, he said that it wasn't the older guy, it was the younger guy. There's a younger guy and an older guy. There's a guy about our age and a guy who's probably like 60. The guy who's around our age, this is what he said. He said that one day, long time ago, one of his family members got kidnapped, and his uncle went to a nearby village to go look for him. And sure enough, the black people, the criminals who were grabbing people for slavery to sell them, they had him in a house, in a hut. He actually had a rifle back then too. This is I don't know how long ago this is, but he had a rifle. So he took back his family member by force. And he said there were other people in the room too, but he just brought his home. And that's an amazing story from West Africa, how an African person rescued their family member from slavery, from being sold off into this trade. But anyway, lost my camera there for a second. Okay, back online. So anyway, I think that was an interesting story. You want to get into you want to comment on that, or you want to get into our document?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do want to comment on that, because while I do think that there have always been kidnappings that have then resulted in slavery, when you look at the proportion, I mean, of people, there are definitely less people that are slaves as a percentage of the population, but there are more people as a pure number that are slaves than there were even at the height of the slave trade. But when you're looking at what was happening back then, while there were kidnappings, most of the slave trade was going to happen from other tribes capturing their enemies and getting rid of them. So historically speaking, this was a valid way of getting rid of your enemies. Basically, you capture them or you defeat them, you enslave or you capture them, and then you get rid of them either by killing them, or you send away the males and you keep whatever women you want, or you could send them away as well, and you keep children. And again,
Gotcha.
This is getting more into West African slavery, which we can talk about because it's very interesting. Once we have a basis for what American slavery looked like, to then differentiate between West African slavery, because by way of slavery, in a lot of ways, it was more humane, which again is a ridiculous thing to say, but it'll make sense when we discuss that more. But right now, what we're going to hop into is basically Black slave owners in the United States. So let's jump into that.
Let's do it. Okay, you want to open the file up? Or do you want me to do it? Yeah, let's see this. It's already open. It's already in there. So let's put it up on screen.
Okay.
And go ahead and you can advance those slides.
Okay, great. So what we're looking at is a journal article written by R. Halliburton. This article was published in 1975. And he starts out by saying, undergraduate history students are usually amazed to learn of the large number of free Blacks in the antebellum period. Graduate students are often surprised to learn that some of these free Blacks owned slaves. History professors are frequently skeptical when they hear the number of free Black slaveholders and the numbers of slaves they owned. So he continues on. He gives a quote from Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is one of America's greatest inventors and one of the most famous Black people from the early period.
Let me throw something in here real quick after that line you just read. I just wanted to tell the viewers, hey, definitely give us a like and a subscribe, guys. We're looking to hit 1,000 subscribers, and we want you to be a part of our community. We have a lot to present to you. Seiji is very good with history, and we're going to revisit this topic in a few different ways and talk about some other interesting things. But speaking of Seiji's presentation, we have some numbers on the amount of African American slaveholders. So go ahead, Seiji.
Yeah, well, it comes as a surprise to most people. I know when I first came across this information, it was very shocking for me to realize that not only, well, I knew that there were free blacks, but I never could conceive of the fact that there were black slave owners in not only the southern states, but across the entire United States. And Halliburton goes on to say, at one time or another, free blacks owned slaves in each of the 13 original states, and later in every state that countenanced slavery. That means every state of the United States at a certain point during the slave owning era had slave owners and had black slave owners, black owners who had slaves.
It's fascinating. Just to kind of reiterate this point, we don't hear about these black slave owners today, and I'm curious as to why. And I think we need to dig into this and figure out why they're not being mentioned. And I personally believe my hypothesis is that it serves the divide of this country. If it's more salacious that only white people own slaves.
It is.
And it shows.
But I think that it also takes power away from the black people in this country.
It does. What it does is it crafts an image of who was in power and who was participating in this evil. And this evil was a triumph for a lot of people. I see every once in a while, I'll see comments online. Like I heard a white guy call into a show once, and he was suggesting, why don't we still have blacks as slaves? And the white host of the show was pretty upset at him, and he challenged him in a way. It was interesting, and he got shut down basically. But slavery is seen as some sort of triumph, and let me just state this. To anyone who brags about human trafficking is trash.
Absolutely.
Is an evil human being. And how easy is it? Of course, anyone could kidnap anyone. You don't think black people could kidnap white people and make them slaves too in Africa? It's easy for several people to overpower one person. Anyone can do that. The same thing can happen to any race of people. So it's nothing special, but it seems that some white Americans really revel in this idea.
I don't think it's only white Americans. I think that
human property.
I think that
it's not only them, but they're the ones who brag about
vocal. Yeah, I mean, I think we should be careful in making
some white Americans, not all.
Yeah.
Obviously, some white Americans loathe this idea and it disgusts them, as it should, because these are the healed people. These are the normal white Americans. But some people with a depraved mind, they think this is something to celebrate. They think this is great. And those people are sick, and they're a product of this sick, twisted institution that still exists. Funny enough, it still exists. It's alive and well. Tons of slaves today, and guess what? The most trafficked slaves. Do you know the answer to this? Hillary Clinton mentioned this. Who are the most trafficked slaves today?
Women.
White women from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And they're being trafficked by white men. It's disgusting and it's sad. It's evil. All right, continue, Seiji. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, we've got a couple other things that are highlighted here for you. So, when you look at black slave owners, you can find records going all the way back to 1654. So, just keep in mind that the country's only about, or not the country, the colonies are only about 30 years old, and you already have records of black slave owners in what was to become the American nation and the American colonies. So it says in 1654, Anthony Johnson and his wife Mary, in a court suit, gained the services of their black servant John Kaser for life. Actually, Slave owning by free Negroes was so common in the period of the Commonwealth as to pass unnoticed and without criticism by those who consciously recorded events of the time. John
And
H.
what's the source
Russell.
for this again? What's the source for our viewers for this piece of
Well,
literature?
this specifically is the Free Negroes in Virginia, 1619 to 1865.
Who's the author? Do you know? Just offhand. I'm not trying to trip you up.
Well, I can go back to the article and.
Here it is. John H. Russell in his Free Negroes in Virginia.
Yeah.
John H. Russell. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. The most remarkable property right possessed by free Negroes was the right to acquire, own, and alienate slaves. Indeed, for more than 20 years from the time when free Negroes first appear in the courts, there was no legal restriction upon their right to own indentured white servants in Virginia. So I want
this
to
is
point
in
this out.
Virginia in particular.
It's in Virginia was like considered at this time like the leader, and later on becomes a leader of the Confederacy in a lot of ways. Along with South Carolina. But I want you to point out that, or I want to point out that we're not talking about blacks owning blacks here. We're saying that blacks can also have white servants or white indentured servants.
Now, where are these white people from? Are these the Irish? Are these the Irish who were brought here?
No, this is about 200 years before the Irish.
Oh, before the Irish were brought. Okay.
Yeah, or about 175 years, because the Irish only come over really in huge numbers after the Irish potato famine in 1840. So
no, I mean the Irish indentured servitude. Is that what you're talking about? Or this?
No,
slavery, quote unquote.
I'm talking about they're probably coming from either England or the German possessions of England.
The white servants, indentured servants.
Correct.
Okay.
There are other
just also
Anglo-Saxon
just to kind of keep.
People.
Okay. Also, Seiji, just we're gonna have to continue this discussion, guys. We're gonna have to continue this. We have about 15 minutes. I'm gonna give Seiji the floor. I may interject here and there, but we have 15 minutes to fully develop this, and then we're gonna come back and do some more. So we'll continue with this slideshow, okay, Seiji? But for now, we have 15 minutes. All right, go ahead, Seiji. Continue.
Okay, so we'll continue on. By 1790, we'll say the other part. There were black slave owners in Boston that were recorded as early as 1724. By 1790, 48 Maryland black slave owners possessed 143 slaves. Nat Butler, a free black who lived near Aberdeen in Hartford County, owned a small farm and regularly purchased and sold Negroes for the Southern trade. Some considered black slave owners hard taskmasters and claimed free black owners were, as a usual thing, much more severe than the white owners. So that what they're saying here is that black slave owners were more brutal and severe than white slave owners.
That's fascinating. One of the things that we want to look into, we may revisit this. Hopefully we'll be able to revisit this later with some documentation. But there are quite a number of black slave owners in the United hundreds, according to the data that we have on some of these slides. And I want to know who these names are. What are their names? We have to have the data. I want to know what these family names are, because I think this would transform Black America if people knew about this. If there were hundreds of Black American families who owned slaves.
Correct. It also shifts the argument. So then if you have a black slave owner, then do we give reparations to the children of the black slave owners?
Right. What's also interesting though? They were once slaves themselves, but they became free. So there is an argument there for reparations. But there's also an argument that they may have to pay reparations to some Black people, which is interesting. Imagine that. Imagine another Black American family having to pay reparations to another Black American family for their involvement in slavery in America. Exactly. And there's hundreds of them. Hundreds. That's fascinating.
Well, let's continue on since we are running out of time. Okay, so there were approximately let's say 320,000 free blacks in the United States in 1830. That was approximately 13.7% of the total black population that was free. A significant number of these free blacks were the owners of slaves. The census of 1830 lists 3,775 free blacks who owned a total of 12,760 slaves. So we're not talking about hundreds. We're talking about more than 3,500 free black people who owned slaves, and they owned more than almost 13,000 slaves.
You know what's interesting? Why hasn't Africa, like, I wonder why this wasn't passed down. I mean, once African Americans, obviously, you know, they had to learn English once they landed on these shores. They learned English, obviously. But there's oral tradition that was passed down and oral lore. Why wasn't this passed down? You would think 3,775 black people who owned 12,000 slaves, you would think somewhere in the 12,760 slaves, there would be some oral tradition being passed down about these black slave owners, especially if they were more cruel. Doesn't that make sense?
I think that there's a lack of scholarship in this area, because it's something that we really want to forget about, because it doesn't fit a lot of the different narratives. It doesn't help. What I would say is like the kind of a black agenda right now either, you know?
Yeah, but it's like, okay, so one theory is that Jim Crow wiped out any of the gains that these so-called free blacks who owned slaves had, because Jim Crow was universal in terms of the United States.
No, it
universal.
wasn't.
Oh, it wasn't.
Jim Crow were specific laws that existed in the southern states. Now, there were
discrimination. Laws, okay, good.
The discrimination existed across the country.
But that's what I'm saying. Like there was, yeah, go ahead.
Jim Crow.
So Jim Crow was the South, which is where most black people lived. So and then, you know, obviously some migrated to the north, a lot migrated to the north, but the discrimination, whether Jim Crow laws, blah, 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 were being enforced there or not, it was the same effect in terms of you couldn't be in this establishment, you couldn't work this type of job, you couldn't be in these circles. It still had the same effect. But anyway, go ahead.
Anyways, let's continue on though. So this is from the Journal of Negro History. I mean, I want you guys to think about that. That's a pretty weird name of a journal, but let's just say that wouldn't fly today. Okay?
Probably wouldn't.
So, and this is where it's discussing who owned slaves and what types of slaves they had as black slave owners. Okay? So then, in many cases, this slavery could have been beneficial for the family, because a black slave owner could be considered a black slave owner if he purchased his wife. But
right,
those are some positive cases. Or a black slave owner is a slave owner if he purchased his son or his daughter, but he didn't grant them their freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's a case. They considered it advisable to put them on probation for a few years. So this is a black slave owner who purchased his wife or husband. And if they did not find them satisfactory, they would sell their wives as other slave owners disposed of Negroes. For example, a Negro shoemaker in Charleston, South Carolina, purchased his wife for $700. But on finding her hard to please, he sold her a few months thereafter for $750, gaining $50 by the transaction.
Wow. So women were difficult back then too. Oh, sorry.
Well, you know, he would have made John Calhoun proud, right?
Oh, wow.
And John Calhoun was the one-time Vice President of the United States, Secretary of War, and also the man who came up with the theory of nullification, and was really a pretty hateful guy in a lot of ways. But he believed that slavery was a positive good. And he actually moved the whole kind of the argument on slavery, even within the South, from being a necessary evil in 1800 to a positive good in 1850, where
So necessary evil, positive good. Okay.
yeah,
Interesting. So it stepped up from necessary evil. I wonder why that
yeah.
happened. Is it just
Well, it's
capitalism at
because they
work?
became more racist, and it became, as the Southern economy boomed with the cotton production, they needed to come up with a way of justifying the horrible brutality towards a whole race of people.
Right.
But anyway, let's
Makes sense.
continue on. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Got 10
says
minutes.
some Negroes purchased and held slaves with the same consideration of profit in view as governed the actions of white owners. Negroes held slaves as permanent property. Indeed, in 1830, the free blacks of Virginia held more wealth in slaves than in real estate.
Interesting.
Jackson stated that slave hiring by free blacks was a common practice. That means that they're basically renting them out to other people. Free black owners were known to hire out their slaves. Moreover, former slaves, after they gained their freedom, sometimes became slave owners themselves. And
So
that
that's
that
interesting.
by yeah, and that by itself is not really problematic because again, like I said, if you buy your wife, you buy your kids, you buy your brother, you become a slave owner, but you're buying them for a specific reason or for a specific and beneficent reason.
So
Often,
some slave owners were cruel, and they said
yes,
this author mentions that the black slave owners were oftentimes more cruel than the white slave owners. And but I would want to know the percentages. What percentage were more cruel? Because it would seem to me that more black slave owners would be doing it for altruistic purposes, to free blacks or to put them in a situation where it would be better for them, because they had to participate in this system that existed. It's not like they necessarily, I don't think they wanted to, but
I think it's clear that some of them did want to because at the end
but
of
it
the
was
day,
there.
I think at the end of the day, we're driven as humans by profit, and that is a very sad thing. But um,
Didn't you mention
money,
that Didn't you mention that the profit motive was to buy more slaves, to get more people to be able to get out of slavery? They may have the title, but they wouldn't necessarily have the same
correct.
existence.
For some people, but look at this guy who sold his wife. He was like, you know what? She's not listening to me. Well, I can make $50. Well, bye bye, Betsy. you know that
Well, it said that he, what did it say? That she was, let's go back a slide. That
it
he was,
says she was hard to please.
she was hard to please. So I mean, that's interesting. I mean, and then it really highlights for me, I look at this and I'm like, okay, what does it mean to have a wife at that point, in slavery? Because I don't think it was the same thing as having a wife now. I think wife was also a title. And I think it was very transactional. I don't think it was what we have now. I really don't think so, because I just find that hard to believe that someone would just sell their wife like that.
Well, I think it depends on it depends on the individual then just as well as now. But anyway, so
Right.
okay, Negroes held slaves as permanent property. And one of the things we talked about is actually the value of slaves owned by free blacks in Virginia was more than the value of the real estate. And there might be reasons for that. For example, there might have been laws that prevented black people from owning real estate, but didn't prevent them from owning other black slaves. So
Right.
we need to be able to delve into that more, and we don't have enough information.
Right.
Okay, well, let's
Got about
continue
five
on.
minutes.
So right
Hmm.
now we have a table over here. So this breaks down the number, according to the 1830 census, there are 3,775 black slave owners. And you can see that they own 12,760 total slaves. And you have a breakdown of who these slave owners or where the slave owners were living based on states. You can see that the vast
This is
majority, uh-huh.
no good. The vast majority. Finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
Well, basically 1/4 of slave owners, black slave owners, lived in Louisiana.
Yeah,
And
Louisiana has a culture of this. This is fascinating,
well,
and so
that's
does
it's also
Maryland.
important to notice that they also have a different culture. They have a kind of Cajun culture that might have been a little bit different than some of the other blacks in the United States.
Yeah, very French. Those people have
Yeah.
French blood. They look different
And
too. A
so
lot.
you
Some
can
of them
look
look different.
in Maryland. Maryland is technically a southern state, but and
Maryland is a
actually
southern state.
Maryland is a southern state, and the only reason it stayed on the side of the Union is because right at the
Interesting.
onset of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln put it under martial law, so they couldn't secede.
Fascinating. Maryland being as small as it is in comparison to Louisiana, look at how many slave owners there were. There's a ton of them.
Yeah, and then if you look at Virginia, so Virginia also had a lot of slave owners, but those slave owners had far fewer slaves, which would make
Right.
sense because by 1830, the tobacco plantations in the South in Virginia are pretty much all used up, and you don't have modern fertilizer yet. So people are beginning to take their slaves and move to the deep South.
Wasn't Virginia one of the landing points for slaves? That was one of the first landing points, was it not?
Yeah, there,
And
Charleston,
mhm.
Baltimore.
I was going to say Florida as well. I think Florida was too. I may be wrong on that. But
Yeah,
yeah, those
Florida.
numbers for Virginia, wow, those are some numbers. Virginia and Louisiana, you know, I would imagine that we got about 3 more minutes. I think we should end on this slide. I would imagine that in doing our research to try to find out some of these family names. Look at this, 948 people, you know, 948 people were
I think we only have 2 more slides. Let's just try finishing them up.
all right, go for it.
Okay. Okay. So here's something on the next slide. It
We've
appears.
disappeared from the screen.
What was that?
We're not
Oh,
on the screen anymore. Let's put ourselves back on the
okay. There
side.
you go.
Okay, cool. There you go.
Halliburton continues on. It says, it appears illogical to assume that free blacks would not desire to own slaves. African blacks had been practicing slavery for centuries. The vast majority of American blacks have consistently attempted to emulate white middle class society. Okay? The free blacks could elevate the free black could elevate his status to a greater degree by owning slaves than in any other way, and the status was desired. So I think
Hmm.
I put this one in
Interesting.
here because I think it's important for us to understand that slavery is not a white problem, it's not a black problem, it's a human problem.
Right.
And when black people had the ability to own slaves in the United States, they also did in considerable numbers. Now, they
Hmm.
didn't have the same opportunity in a lot of cases to own slaves, but given the
A lot of them
opportunity,
did.
they did exercise the right to have slaves. And to finish up, I want you to continue. I want to continue on. It says, a free black in Trimble County, Kentucky, sold his own daughter, son, and daughter south, one for $1,000 and the other for $1,200. There are many instances in which fathers sold their children. A father sold his slave children in order to purchase his wife.
A
A
Maryland
Columbus,
father.
Georgia
Interesting.
black woman, Dilsey Pope, owned her husband. He
See, there's
offended
a name
her,
right there.
and she sold him.
You know, it's interesting. Let's pause right there. Pope.
Uh-huh.
There are Black Americans with that name right now. They may be related to her. I want to look into this. Go ahead, continue.
Fanny Kennedy of Louisville, Kentucky, owned her husband Jim, a drunken cobbler whom she threatened to sell down the river. At New Bern, North Carolina, a free black wife and son purchased their slave husband father. When the newly brought father criticized his son sold him to a slave trader. The son boasted afterward that the old man had gone to the cornfields about New Orleans where they might learn him some manners. So I think that I put this last paragraph in because I want people to see that black women owned black men and they sold them when they were their husband. They said, you know what? You are kind of telling me what to do. I don't want you anymore. You even have cases where fathers sold their children. You have a case where a son sold his father. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but this highlights the fact that men, and that by men I mean humankind, we've made huge mistakes over time. We do bad things. It's not only white people who do bad things. It's black people, Asian people, Indian people, Arab people, Eskimo people, everyone.
Right.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
I'm sorry. Finish off that and let me see what I was going to
So
say.
when we go to one of the things that you said is black people owning white people. And that's something we could talk about later on because
Yeah, we'll get into
there
that.
are black people who would raid all the way to Iceland, capturing white women and selling them in slave markets. So black people did own white people and sold white people into slavery in Africa as well. Slavery was not something one race perpetrated on another race. Slavery
Gotcha.
was
But why was that
something
narrative?
Huh?
But the narrative, just to kind of go
Yes.
back to that, the narrative about that is being used as a power play. Because obviously these historians know this. They know that these black people were doing this because obviously you read it somewhere. But they're not including that information because they're using it as a dividing line, as a way to draw attention to themselves as power, in power. Anyway, go ahead. Let's wrap up.
In terms of a unique perspective, what I want you guys to think about is if you're, let's say, a little black kid in a class and you are just hearing about how your people or your race is powerless, you're being oppressed all the time. In some sick, twisted way, might it help for you to also know that black people actively captured white people and sold them into slavery as well? So that it wasn't just one race that was powerless and one race that was powerful, but instead, slavery was something that went back and forth. It was a fluid situation.
All right, Seiji, our last point. Where were these black people? Well, actually, let's save that for next time. We're going to get into that. The Barbary slave trade, right? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get into that next time. We'll have a presentation on that. Guys, share this podcast. This is incredible information. No one else is talking about this. Seiji is pretty much a historian. And Seiji, we're gonna go and wrap up, okay?
Absolutely.
We're gonna to be continued, guys. Like, subscribe for more. We have a lot more
and
coming.
Please comment because we would love to hear your feedback. We could all learn together. Sure. That way, if you ask me something, I'm a curious type of person. I will try finding information on it.
Excellent. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you for joining us here on the Sage Board podcast. And as always, guys, we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.